Bonjour tout le monde. Mon français n'est pas trop fort, so I'm going to continue the rest of this in English. So, a little while back, I was stood on a stage not unlike this one, addressing a room full of business leaders working on sustainability. Leaders who, according to the organizers, had outsized responsibility they didn't know what to do with. Now, as an activist of over a decade, I've been in many rooms like this one. I've petitioned for change within the boardrooms of Fortune 50 companies, on stage at TED, and of course at COP negotiations. And yet this time was different. Because as I started to relay the climate facts that I'd committed to memory, the fact that we've now surpassed 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries, or that we've crossed the 1.5 degree threshold, someone in the audience started to boo. I stopped, startled, trying to locate the voice, but then it was joined by another and another. This wasn't a solidarity boo. It was a get off the stage boo. And to be honest, it felt like a nightmare come to life, being pinned beneath a spotlight as I was heckled by an angry mob dressed in cocktail attire. Now, this moment marked a shift in the tide, because while, of course, I had faced confrontation, my decade of activism felt buoyed by momentum. In the wake of the COP21 Paris Agreement, which set out the 1.5 degree threshold, there was a flurry of commitments. Climate action was suddenly cool. And while corporations were afraid of missing the boat, governments scrambled to appease angry citizens who were organizing through movements like the Youth Strikes for Climate and Extinction Rebellion. Even fossil fuel companies, the original architects of climate denial and delay, were suddenly parroting the words that were splashed across our placards. The election of right-wing figures like Trump and Bolsonaro were dismissed as temporary setbacks. And yet, we are now midway through the decisive decade for climate. And the world has changed in many ways. In some ways, unrecognizably so. But unfortunately, for those of us who have been petitioning for change, it hasn't gone quite in the direction we would have hoped. The once distant predictions of scientists are now a steady drumbeat of our daily lives. Wildfires that are visible from space. Biblical flooding in Texas, Bavaria, New South Wales. Drought across the Horn of Africa. Each disaster is broadcast to our smartphones in real time. Yet climate and the environment have slid down the ladder of voters' priorities, usurped by the cost of living, national security, and increasingly immigration. Trump 2.0 has led the largest ever rollback of environmental protections in US history. And tech giants who now shape every corner of our lives quietly shelved their climate commitments in favor of AI, ravenous in its appetite for water and energy. So, how did we veer so steeply off course? Maybe it's in part because this momentum was built on shaky ground, punctuated by hollow buzzwords. Carbon capture has proven a costly distraction, prolonging our reliance on fossil fuels. Offsetting has turned ecological destruction into a clever balance sheet exercise. And vague net zero commitments have allowed leaders, particularly our politicians, to make the issue someone else's, to kick it down the road as far as possible. These solutions, and the people who champion them, failed to recognize something critical. The climate crisis is not merely a crisis of technology. It is a crisis of power. Because behind the glossy pledges, a handful of actors have been amassing ever more social, cultural, political, and economic influence. Today, the wealthiest 26 people own as much as the world's poorest 3.8 billion. Corporations have lobbied relentlessly to stop regulation and to secure pliant politicians. Media conglomerates, many of which owned by the same elites, have twisted public discourse and created convenient scapegoats to deflect attention from themselves, from the trans community one month to people arriving by small boat the next. And since I'm passing blame, many of us within the climate community failed to call out this power grab or the defense of economic growth that it so often masquerades behind. Those who challenge the status quo are very quickly dismissed as radicals, naive, or even communist, as I was when Elon Musk, soon to be the world's first trillionaire, turned me into a meme. The deep-seated disillusionment that we see today across the political spectrum is born out of betrayal. Citizens were promised a fairer and a greener world, and instead face rising bills, declining nature, and increased inequality. Each broken promise corrodes trust. And what fills this gap when governments, corporations, and international agreements fail to deliver? That gap creates a dangerous vacuum, one filled by populist figures like Trump and Farage, who thrive on division. If this past decade has taught us anything, it's that tinkering at the margins will simply not suffice. Real solutions must confront power head-on. Who holds it, who benefits, and who is left to suffer? And that means discarding some dangerous myths. The first myth is that those who profit from this current extractive system are going to be the ones to solve it or to change it. They simply have no reason to. The second is the myth of individualism, spoon-fed to us daily through consumerism and social media. This idea that we can somehow survive without nature or without one another, that we are fundamentally selfish by nature, when our very evolution shows that we are a cooperative species. And finally, we must retire the myth that your neighbor is the enemy, or that you have less in common with someone who is seeking safety by a small boat instead of the person who owns the super yacht. In moments of crisis, whether a pandemic or a climate disaster, you quickly learn how much you need your neighbors. And so the real work ahead of us must be collective, building movements, shaping institutions, and redistributing power. Individual action only becomes transformative when it is joined up. We don't need 100 perfect activists, we need millions of imperfect ones, whether you feel comfortable calling yourself an activist or not. That also means learning to cooperate across our differences and building a tent that is big enough for us all. Now, around the world, pockets of resistance are growing. In Switzerland, a group of women over the age of 64 sued their government for failing to protect them from deadly heat waves. And they won, establishing a new precedent for climate justice grounded in human rights. Citizens' assemblies, from France to Ireland, have shown that ordinary people, when provided information and the space to deliberate, are able to produce decisions that are far bolder than parliaments caught in gridlock ever can. From New York City to London, a new generation of political figures are rising, fighting against authoritarianism and building platforms that channel anger into constructive energy, directed not at migrants or minorities, but at those who profit from our collective suffering. We're also seeing glimmers in the corporate world. Faith in Nature became the first company in the world to appoint nature to its board, giving the natural world a voice and a vote. Tony's Chocolonely bakes ethics directly into their commercial model, with a focus on radical transparency across their supply chains and mandating a living wage. Fintechs like Triodos Bank are governed explicitly around ecological and social purpose. The cooperative group is owned by its workers, and a growing number of B Corps have adopted articles of association that hold them accountable not to a handful of shareholders, but to their many stakeholders. These examples are the exception, but they hint at the kind of transformation that is possible. Because this latest wave of change is not vested in one leader or one institution. It is plural, participatory, and accountable. It may be nascent, but it points to the possibility of a politics that is rooted in shared trust and stewardship, where democracy isn't as flimsy as going to the polls once every few years and being asked to choose between a climate change denier and a seasoned procrastinator, but where democracy is an everyday practice. It is not too late to change course. But to do so, we must be honest with one another. Honest about how we got here, and honest about where we go to next. And honest about the fact that we are not going to be saved by billionaires buying islands and building bunkers, but by the billions of us who are demanding change. Speaking out can feel incredibly uncomfortable. But if enough of us do it together, our voices can rise into a tide too powerful to be silenced or booed. Thank you. Merci.